there has indeed been a fundamental transformation, not just in the scope and scale of government action, but also in its basic forms, in the tools that the government uses, the instruments that governments use to address public problems. Where the governments used to be restricted largely to the direct delivery of goods or services, increasingly it has come to embrace a wide array of additional tools, loans, guarantees, subsidies, insurance, and so on. And each tool, the more that governments rely on tools of this nature and less on direct provision of goods and services, the entire shape, the form of the government keeps changing. And the equation between the government and the private sector also keeps changing. Because each of these tools, grants, subsidies, they all have their own operating procedures. They have their own skill requirements, their own delivery mechanisms. Some of them, for instance, rely extensively on commercial banks to extend assisted credit to qualified borrowers. So we actually see through when loans or loan guarantees operate that there is less of physical involvement of the government in that provision of good or service. The point is, many of the tools, many of the instruments that governments are increasingly favoring, they are indirect in nature, highly indirect. They rely on a wide assortment of third parties, like I mentioned, banks and insurance companies and hospitals and so on, to deliver publicly financed services for publicly authorized purposes. What we need to acknowledge is that it's not a simple delegation of duties from the government to the private sector. We are increasingly witnessing that even in the exercise of discretion over the use of public authority and public funds, the private sector is coming to have an increasing say. Involvement of private sector in this manner, in this kind of partnership, entails enormous problems. There is the management challenge to start with. Each of the different tools has its own, like I mentioned earlier also, each of that has its own decision rules, its own rhythms, its own agents, its own management requirements, and so on. So there is first the question of the management challenge that needs to be overcome. Accompanying this management challenge is the accountability challenge. As we just acknowledged, the private sector is increasingly playing the role of government, and therefore this raises question of accountability. Who is responsible? There is also the legitimacy challenge, perhaps most significantly. Legitimacy challenge brings in a political dimension. Is this the right approach for a government to adopt? Bringing in the private sector into the traditional government domain. Of course, like we have already acknowledged, we have to bring in, we cannot take, take positions. We cannot say favor one or the other. We cannot say the changing phase of the government that we are increasingly witnessing is the right way. We cannot at the same time say it is wrong. What we intend to do as part of our deliberations on this topic is to understand what is the right approach to taking decisions on this. Break.